Hi Orchid lovers, welcome back to Orchid 101. Today we are going to do a real quick Q&A. I have a lot of questions that I have received over the weeks, and I really haven't had a chance to do a formal Q&A for you guys because I have just been so busy with life. So today I'm just going to go over some of those questions and I'm going to try to answer them to the best of my abilities. So let's go ahead and get started now. I do have a lot of things here going on the table, as you guys can see, and I just brought out some of the orchids that I have that can best relate to the questions that you guys have. So I'll be using these orchids to demonstrate and to better help me answer your questions. So I hope I can answer those questions to the best of my ability, and I hope my answers can definitely help you with your orchids in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. So question number one, let's talk humidifiers. How close should they be to the orchids? How often should it be turned on? And how long? This question is really all up to preference, and because I keep my orchids outside and because I live in Florida, I don't normally keep a humidifier on unless it's during the winter months and I bring my orchids inside. But I do keep a humidifier fairly close to the orchids because the humidifiers are a cold mist, so they're not going to affect like the heat or anything like that with the orchids, and they are going to benefit from being so close to the humidity. So if you're keeping your orchids like in an enclosed cabinet, or if you're keeping your orchids in a greenhouse or anything like that, you want to keep the humidifier fairly close. If you read online, normally it tells you that it's beneficial to keep several orchids together in order to create more humidity. So you want to do something to that effect in order to create that humidity around your orchid. So the closer you can place your humidifier to your orchid, the better, because the humidity builds up more. So that's just in my opinion. I feel like the more humidity is surrounded the orchid, the better it will do. Next question. Okay, I'm going to a local nursery on Saturday. I'm excited, but I'm not super knowledgeable on types of orchids. I've had orchids for a few years, but I've just had the original Phalaenopsis from the box stores. What should I look for as a newbie to more unique / harder to care for orchids? Well, when you visit a nursery, you're going to find all types of orchids, from Phalaenopsis to Dendrobiums to Oncidiums, Cattleyas, all kinds of orchids. But if you really want to get into moving out of the Phalaenopsis, if you feel like you have mastered the art of taking care of Phalaenopsis and you know for sure that those are not going to die on you and you already know how to take care of those, I would move on to something like the Cattleyas. They are beautiful flowers. They are fairly easy to take care of. They do need more water sometimes than the regular Phalaenopsis, and they do bloom. They don't have as many blooms as the Phalaenopsis, but their blooms are definitely magnificent. For example, I have this one over here as well that only has one bloom because it is a very big bloom. So, you know, you can move on to the Cattleyas. You can also move on to the Oncidiums, like this one. So it's just all up to preference, what kind of blooms you're looking for, what type of flower show you want. Also, what do you have time for? A lot of people like, especially new people who are getting into orchids for the first time, they like the Phalaenopsis because they are orchids that don't require a lot of attention, versus other orchids that may require a lot more attention. So it depends on what you have time for and what you don't have time for. If your schedule allows for more time to take care of these plants, then, you know, go ahead and try out these other varieties. But if your schedule doesn't allow for a lot of time, then I would, you know, continue to stick to the Phalaenopsis. You can also go to the dendrobiums. Dendrobiums go through a time of hibernation during the winter months. So that gives you a little bit of a break from watering and things like that. So, you know, it just all depends on your schedule. It depends on what kind of flowers you like, what kind of flowers you want to see, things like that. So I would definitely maybe play around with them a little bit, not invest too much money in too many different types of orchids just yet, but until you finally find the type that you definitely love, and then you can start dedicating more time to them. All right, let's see what our next question is. My plants have always been on my windowsill. Can I just put them outside? Definitely. It depends, however, on your climate. If you live in a dry, cold climate, I don't recommend it as much. But if you live in a climate similar to mine, where it's hot, even during the winter sometimes, or it's humid, and it's a very tropical like climate, then yes, you can bring your orchids outside, given that the area that you put your orchids in have enough shade. You do not want to put your orchids in direct sunlight. If you have trees, you may want to put them under trees. If you have a balcony or a lanai or things like that, you may want to put them in those areas. Don't put your orchids in direct sunlight if you are moving them from indoor to outdoor. And always remember, whenever you're moving your orchids from one area to the other, give them some time to get acclimated to that new setup. So if they were inside in the cool air and you're moving them outside where it might be hot and warm, for the first few days, they might look a little sad. They might look a little stressed out. That's totally normal until they get used to that new environment, that new air, that new heat. You know, all of that stuff comes into play when you're moving orchids around. So don't fear, don't think your orchids are going to die and things like that. Just make sure that you're giving them enough time to get acclimated. Don't move them back and forth from one day to another either. All right, next question. I recently moved my orchids to a cooler temperature at night for a few weeks, hoping to get them to spike. About 3 weeks after I did this, all of them got a new leaf and new roots. Should I expect a spike soon, or is this all the new growth that is going to happen right now? No, that is not all that's going to happen. So let me show you one. I also have an orchid that has new leaf. It also has new roots. If I pull it out of here, oh, it's kind of stuck. It also has a lot of new roots in here. But if you notice, it is about to bloom. It has a lot of new buds. So no. A lot of the beauty of orchid growing is patience. Just because your orchid is not producing buds and a spike as fast as you want it to, that does not mean it's not going to happen. So if you see that your orchid is producing a leaf, a new leaf, and new roots, new growth is always good. So if you see that your orchid is producing all these new things, most of the time, I would say 95% of the time, immediately after those new growths start, you will start seeing a flower spike. If your flower, or if your orchid is producing new things, that means you're doing a good job and you're in the right direction, and it's happy, and it should not have any problems producing anything else. So just give it time, be patient, and unfortunately, orchids are very slow growing plants, so you just have to be very patient. All right, next question. Is there a specific spray for the flowers of orchids? This question is not very specific. So if you mean a spray to maybe clean the flowers, I don't recommend anything to clean the flowers with. Flowers shouldn't really be sprayed down. They should naturally stay, you know, that way. You shouldn't really be wetting them. Now, if you're talking about spraying something like a bloom buster or a type of fertilizer to make your orchid flower faster, I think I've mentioned this before in my previous videos. I don't normally use bloom busters. I use just one specific orchid fertilizer, which is the MSU Feed Me formula from repotme.com, 13-3-15 here. And as I always say, if you fertilize your orchids correctly and the roots are doing good, the leaves look good, the roots look good, the leaves look good, and everything on the plant look good, then your flower show will be spectacular. So as long as the plant is healthy and happy, you do not need a bloom buster, because there's no need for that when your flower itself is going to produce its best flowers, because everything else on it is happy. So you can definitely try a bloom buster if you want to. I don't personally use any specific flower spray for the blooms, for the flowers. There is many out there in the market, but like I said, if you just stick to one specific fertilizer, your orchid will be very happy. Our next question is, my mini Phalaenopsis had a nice air root that has since dried up and shriveled. It is near my humidifier, but we are dry and I can't get more than 40% or so. Can I cut it off, as I don't think it is doing anything anymore? Yes. So if you have air roots, and I have an example right here. This is it's not a mini Phalaenopsis like this person has, but this is an orchid that does have air roots. As you can see here, I have an air root right here. And if you have an aerial roots that have shriveled up similar to these that I have here, and you feel like they're really not doing much anymore, you can definitely cut them off. And I'm gonna show you real quick. I'm gonna just cut one off because I have been meaning to do this for a while now. I just haven't had time. But you can cut it off right before the good portion of the root starts. And this dried up shrivel part, you can just toss away. So my Phalaenopsis here has a few that are just kind of sticking out of the pot. And there is no problem with you cutting away those shriveled up pieces. Now, don't go and cut the good aerial roots, like this one right here that's green and healthy. Don't cut those. Those are good, healthy roots. But yes, you can cut the shriveled up aerial roots. Our next question. I have my first ever new spike, which I am unbelievably excited about. And I'm wondering when I should attach it to the stake. I assume it's too small now. I'm just hoping to know in advance when the best moment is. So when you have a new orchid and it's starting to spike, the stake, as you see there in the picture, starts growing and it's very small. And at that stage, it's extremely fragile. If you stake it when it's that small, you will eventually cause it to break. I actually made this mistake once with my orchids when I was first starting to grow them. I prefer to start staking, to stake a spike when it becomes similar to this one here, longer and thick. When you feel the stake and it's very thick and it feels literally like a piece of a stick, that's when you can stake it. I would wait for it to be very firm, very green. You know, you can't bend it easily, things like that. Not when it's little like this, when you can still see little light shades of green. Don't touch it yet. That means it's not ready. You can very much so break it. Once you break that stake, it's not going to keep growing. You've already killed it. So just be very careful with that. I got a happy looking orchid at the store last week and was happy that it was planted in bark. But at a closer look, it had a plug and no holes in the plastic container. And the roots were wet, and up against the edges, I cut off one black root. But do I need to cut this one too? It looks a little black too. So if you see there in the picture, they're pointing at a little root that is small. It's very short, and then at the end it has what seems to be like a little black blemish. I would not cut that, because even though the root there has a little black blemish at the end, it's still a very healthy looking root. It's not shriveled, it's not papery, it's not squishy. If you touch it and it's not squishy in any way, then it's a root that will most likely continue to grow. Now, she did mention in her question that it's planted in bark, but at a closer look, it had a plug. And what a plug is normally at the supermarkets or hardware stores or things like that, they get these orchids from nurseries that have grown the orchid from seeds. So they grow the orchids in plugs, but these orchids never get repotted. So when they send them to the stores, they send them to the stores in new pots with new media in them, but the plugs are still in the orchids from when they started growing into the adult orchid. So I would personally have taken this orchid out of its original pot, repotted it, removed that plug, and cut away all of the dead roots that it had, because if she did have dead roots on the edges and already aerial roots that were already rotted out, most likely there is some of that rotting underneath that. So just my opinion, I would have just taken that out, even if it's in bloom. If I see a problem above the surface, most likely there's a problem under the surface. So even if it was in bloom, I would have taken that out, and I would have just repotted it and, you know, and left it at that, and definitely taken off that plug. There's no need for a plug on a mature orchid anymore. So I hope that helps. All right, next question. What do I do with the stalk once the flowers fall off? So the spike, in this question, she referred to it as a stalk. You can do one or two things. Some people like to do a third. I don't personally mess with that third option, but I'll talk about it anyways. When the spike is spent, which means that your flowers have fallen off, because we all know that flowers do not last forever, you can do one thing, which is cut the spike all the way down to the crown and continue to take care of your orchid as normal, and a new spike will eventually start growing. It'll produce a new spike, and a new spike will start growing. If you have a spike with healthy nodes, and I believe I have mentioned this in other videos before, if you have a spike where you have a node, so a node is this right here, and you see that the node is green, and it could be the start of a secondary spike, then you would just do what I did here and cut that a few centimeters, cut the old spike a few centimeters above the node, and then you'll get what I got here, which is the secondary spike, and then, you know, it started blooming. It started budding, and then it'll bloom. Now, the third option that people like to experiment with, like I said, do not experiment with that, is people like to go out and buy what's called cakey paste, and they put the cakey paste on the node that looks to be the start of a secondary spike, and out of that node they will get a cakey, and then they leave the spike on the plant. You could do that. I don't prefer to do that. Normally when a cakey is produced from the mother plant, it takes a lot of energy from the mother plant, and in my experience that has led to the mother plant being very stressed out, having to use a lot of energy to make sure that that keiki survives. So you can cause the mother plant to die, you can cause it to become malnourished, you can cause it to have some deficiencies. So I don't like to mess with keikis and keiki paste, because I just feel like it's an unnatural way to grow a keiki. Now, if a mother plant, you know, naturally grows a keiki, then that's fine. I can leave it on there and I'll wait for it to be mature enough for me to separate it from the mother plant. But I don't induce a keiki with a keiki paste. But that is a third option. But if you don't like to do that, like me, then your options are to cut it down to the base, or cut it to a few centimeters above the node, and then hope for a secondary spike to begin to produce, which is the two most common things that orchid growers do. All right, our next question. What are your favorite stakes? I know a lot of people don't use them. I do use them for some of my plants. I just want to know which ones people who do use them use. So she is talking about stakes, and she's talking about flower supports, the support rods. And I do use them. I like to, some people do like to leave their orchids, you know, free and let them just hang freely, like they do in the wild, and just have that natural look to them. But I do like to use the support rods because I like my orchids to stand up nicely. I like to display the flowers in the position that I feel would most likely look nice and all that. So I use a variety of rods. I use the plastic rods. A lot of the times they don't deteriorate, they don't decompose inside the media with the water. I also use the regular green bamboo rods that normally come with all the orchids when you buy them from the store and the nurseries. So I have a lot of those because I take them off the orchids once the spikes are spent and I have to cut them. So the regular bamboo rods are also ones that I use. And then I also use, some of them I use metal, just regular metal rods. And then I have started using regular like wooden bamboo skewers, like the type that you would use like on the grill to make shish kebabs, because they are a great temporary fix to a lot of issues that I have had to fix with my orchids. And also because they're small, they're short, and it's really hard for me to find the bamboo green support rods in this short of a size. So I've started using these a lot. Now these do decompose fast, and I mean they'll last a couple of months or so, but just as a temporary fix or just to hold up a stake, a spike, you know, temporarily, they're a great tool. And I've used them not only for spikes, but I've used them to hold up, you know, the pseudobulbs, or just to like support the orchid if the orchid is too tall and it's leaning or things like that. I just like them because they're short, and sometimes it's really hard to find these in the shorter versions of them. So these are all the kinds that I use. All right, this person is asking, is this worth saving? And as you can see, she is showing us a picture of a very stressed out Phalaenopsis with a definite some root rot, some crown rot there. I would say yes, your Phalaenopsis is definitely worth saving. I actually have a Phalaenopsis here that had a similar or worse issue than that one. I actually made a video on this one. It's one of my struggling orchid videos. This Phalaenopsis, as you guys can see here, still has not produced a lot of roots. I have 3 sort of okay roots here, It still has the crown rot going on. This is where I cut off all of the roots. And now recently, it started growing a new leaf. So I think if my orchid is doing okay, and then the leaves have also started to gain a little bit more strength. Before I did all of this to it to try to help it, the leaves were very rubbery and very fragile. So, and I put it in this setup so that it can photosynthesize in the sun, and then the water in the clear vase here so that it can get some humidity. So I think that if you maybe try out this setup, and also if my orchid, which has a lot less roots than yours there, can definitely survive and start getting some new growth, I think yours would definitely have some new growth. You also have what looks like to be some more leaves than I do. So I would definitely try to continue to save your orchid if you really want to. You have a lot more roots than I do. Your roots look to be a lot more healthy. So I would definitely continue to try to save that. All right, we have just a couple more to go. Do we need to change the soil? She put that in quotations. If so, how often and when should we change it? Should we move to a bigger container to promote bigger and better roots? Are there specific nutrient or fertilizer types things for orchids? Okay, so this is a couple of questions in one. So her first question, do we need to change the soil? First of all, orchids do not get planted in soil, but I think I know what she meant. Yes, the media that you have your orchids in should be changed out every 2 to 3 years, depending on the type of media you use. If you're using leca, which is a clay type of media, it does not decompose, so that you can leave there forever because it's clay and it never breaks down. If you're using bark or sphagnum moss or charcoal chips or any of that other stuff, that does decompose. Some of them faster than others, but yes, those should be replaced every 2 to 3 years, maybe sooner. I always recommend everybody to keep their eyes on their media, because media can develop mold from the watering. If you're watering too much, it could develop bad smells, it could develop fungus, it could develop worms, it could develop a variety of different things. So always keep an eye out for your media. But if you are watering correctly and your media is good, then you can safely replace and repot your orchids every 2 to 3 years. Now, her second question, how often should we do it? Like I said, every 2 to 3 years. Should we move an orchid to a bigger container to promote bigger and better growth? No. If your orchid is in a container and it is doing good, but it has aerial roots coming out, or it has, if you just feel like the container is not big enough for it anymore, sometimes depending on the type of orchid, I would say yes. However, orchids like to be in tight spaces. So if you see your orchid is doing very well in that pot, I would not touch it from that pot. If you're gonna repot it, I would put it back in that pot if it fits in that pot. Other than that, I would not touch it, because like I said, they like tight spots. They do not like to be spaced out. Also, if you put an orchid in a pot with too much space, you can risk overwatering and causing root rot. The more space that you have, the more media you put in there, the more media that stays wet longer, and you can cause a lot of root rot with that. So you don't want to cause that, and you don't want to have, crown or root rot as a case of that. Are there specific nutrients or fertilizer types for orchids? Yes, they are. Orchids should be fertilized with specific orchid only fertilizers, and they do have nutrients specifically just for orchids. I don't recommend that you fertilize orchids with any other type of fertilizer that you would use on other regular houseplants, or just regular, like landscaping fertilizer, because orchids are very, very fragile. Their roots are very different than any other plants. So there are fertilizers specifically just for orchids that's what you should be using. All right, I think we are almost at the home stretch. 2 more questions. I was told my orchid would only produce leaves or flowers. Is that true? I would have to say no. Your orchid would not only produce leaves and flowers. Your orchid will produce, you know, buds. Your orchid would produce the spike that the flowers will grow on. Your orchids may produce a keiki, like we've talked before, which is a baby growing from the mother plant. You know, for the most part, your orchid will produce leaves and flowers. That is probably what people will look at and will catch their eyes the most. But your orchid has a lot of different variables to it, and that's not the only thing it grows. And finally, is this normal? Is it a root? And as you can see there, it is a picture of an aerial root. And like I talked before with the example I gave here of my orchid with the aerial root, yes, that is normal. And yes, that is a root. And no, you should not cut it. And the way you water it is with a spray bottle. You can just mist it. If it's gray, like how mine's is right now, that means it needs water. Once you water it, it will turn green. Once it gets gray again, that means it needs water again. It's dehydrated when it's gray. So yes, it's normal. Aerial roots means your orchid is happy. It is growing roots all over the place. So a happy orchid has aerial roots. Don't touch them. And that is all the questions we have today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I am always up for answering questions and sharing my knowledge. And as I always ask, we do have a Facebook group. Go ahead and join our Facebook group. I have shared the link down below in the description. And once again, thank you guys for watching. Bye-bye.